Work was hectic, and we had two residents that passed away in the same hour. I went into the room of my last resident for the night. She was still sane and a very capable person. I walked into her room to find her crying. "Lisa, what's the matter, honey?" I asked. "They said they're coming soon," she replied. "Who's coming?" "Albert and Joanne," the two residents that had just passed away. Goosebumps rose all over my body, and I asked, playing along, "Lisa, why are they coming?" "They say everyone leaves in pairs of 3, and they need a third person." I'm terrified, and I tell her I have to grab something for her bath and I'll be right back. We'll have the occasional unexpected death, so I was creeped out. She was one of my favorite residents, and we had a deep connection. I walked out and reported what I talked about with her to my supervising nurse. Sometimes it could be a form of dementia developing. The nurse said she'd go check in on Lisa after I've given her a bath. I went to give her her bath, which will conclude my shift for the night. The whole time helping her bathe, she's hysterical, crying, saying she doesn't want to die yet. She was 86 years old, but still independent. I calmed her, saying that after I leave for the night, the nurse will come in to check on her every 2 hours, and if anything happens, to let her next caregiver or the nurse know. I punched up at 11, feeling overwhelmed and heartbroken. It was a crazy and long day at work, and I just wanted to fall asleep when I got home. But I have a 6-month-old who, of course, did not sleep when I want her to. My husband was working 10 p.m. to 10 a.m., so I had to stay up with her. I laid in bed watching Netflix while my daughter was in her crib playing. I felt my eyes getting heavy and began to fall asleep. In the far distance, I could still hear my daughter playing and giggling. I thought to myself, she's fine. I'm going to allow myself to just fall asleep for a minute. I heard my daughter wailing and jerked awake. I turned to my right towards her crib, but she wasn't there. I was disoriented but soon realized she was on the bedroom floor. I bolted towards her. How did she fall out? I caressed and soothed her until she stopped crying. I brought her into bed with me and mixed up her bottle. She took it right away and she too was falling asleep. Afterwards, I fell asleep instantly. I was awake again by my daughter's loud laughter. I thought to myself, getting irritated, "Baby, why are you up playing? Mama's too tired to play with you." Then I looked at my phone. 3 a.m. That's when I noticed somebody was standing by the side of my bed where the baby was laughing. I didn't realize and recognize her right away. She looked different, a little younger and more healthy. "Kay, you have a lovely baby. I feel like I know her already by the stories you're always telling me." I was deeply afraid, so I reached for my daughter and held her tightly to me. "Kay, I'm sorry I dropped your baby. I wanted to hold her before I go, and I wanted to visit you. You're my favorite CNA, and when you left, you were really worried about me. It didn't hurt at all, but I have to go. I'm only allowed a little time to say my goodbyes. Albert and Joanne were waiting for me. See?" She pointed to my bedroom corner. I could make out 2 shadows. I couldn't see their faces or body features. "I have to go now. Thank you for always being so kind to me." All 3 of them vanished in a blink of an eye. I released my grip on my daughter, and I cried. I was terrified, heartbroken, and touched. I just cried. Lisa had passed away that night, and I was the one she chose to come say goodbye for the last time. I used to work as a cleaner at a community hospital during the night shift. My job was mainly to sweep and clean the basement and the medical surgical floors of the hospital at night. At first, I didn't think much about my job. Usually after 9 o'clock at night, the main entrance of the hospital locks, quiet hours start, and lights are dimmed on the floors and visitors seem to vanish. I always begin my shift cleaning the basement level first, then making my way up to the medical surgical floors later. One night, after I finished sweeping the basement level, I felt very unusual, like as if I wasn't alone. Even though there wasn't a human being in sight, I had a feeling like there was a presence right there with me. I didn't think much of it and just shrugged the feeling off. I hauled my cleaning cart with me as I carefully made my way over to where the elevators were located. As I approached, I felt a light, chilly breeze brace my arm, and I saw a lady in a hospital gown walk right past me, her face pale and frightened. She quickly passed me and disappeared out of sight, like as if she didn't notice me. I thought to myself, why was it that there was a patient on the floor at this time? Could she be lost? Could she be a patient? Or is it a ghost? I turned my back to the elevators and realized that all 3 elevators were not even opened. The hairs on my head, neck, back, arms, and legs were standing perpendicular as I realized that a ghost had just passed by. What else could explain how the patient came out of the unopened elevator? My heart was racing and my body felt weak. I walked as fast as I could over to the elevator and pressed the button to call the elevator down. I wanted to get off the basement level immediately. I waited impatiently as I listened for the elevator to descend from the floors above. As the elevator approached the basement level, I heard voices talking loudly, like there was a crowd of people inside the elevator. I felt relieved to hear people talking after my encounter from earlier. As the elevator came to a stop, I could hear the voices clearly as if there was a party going on inside. Ding! I watched as the elevator doors slide open. To my surprise, there was not a single person in sight, and the voices went silent as an empty elevator stood before me. I almost choked on my fear, unable to scream or speak. I rushed into the elevator with my cart. It was either the elevator or remain at the basement level, and I chose the elevator. Just get me out of here. I could hear my heart pounding loudly as the elevator ascended to the next floor. I finally made it to the medical surgical floor and rushed out as soon as the doors of the elevator opened. I saw the nurse's station in the distance and finally felt some sort of relief. I pushed my cart down the hallway and made my way over to the nurse's station. Seeing the nurses working at the computers made me feel so much better. It was good to see people. One of the nurses looked at me and said, "How are you tonight?" I calmly responded, "I'm fine." The same nurse then asked, "Are you sure? You look like you've seen a ghost." And then I screamed, "I did!" All the nurses started laughing at me like I was joking. I seriously just wished they would have just seen or saw what I heard. I knew they didn't believe me, so I just walked away calmly. I made my way over to the closet where I usually restocked my cleaning supplies and opened the door with a key. It was dark inside, so I switched on the light and started restocking my cart. As I was bending over to dump the bucket of dirty water into the drain, I felt a cold, chilly hand grasp my nape firmly. I reacted, shrieking hysterically as I dropped everything and ran down the hall back to the nurse's station. The nurses huddled around me and asked if I was okay. Shaking and sweating, I responded, "I need to go home. I'm not feeling too well." I left that night and since then had resigned from the night shift at the hospital. Hospitals are filled with wandering spirits, and I refused to work there ever again. Later on, I asked a lady in town whom had a sixth sense to look into what happened to me that night. She told me that what I saw, heard, and felt was not of my imagination. She said those spirits whom I had encountered may have forgotten to be careful around the living and may have exposed themselves a little too much. Spirits can sense fear, and when they do, like to take advantage of the living. The lady told me not to worry anymore, as she had already worked up some magic to ease my fears and protect me. I feel much better now and have gotten over those encounters from that night. During our first night after my wife gave birth, The nurses asked if we wanted them to take Zachary, our son, into the nursery so we could sleep. We declined the offer because, although we were both exhausted, we were too excited. Around 9 p.m., my wife asked me to grab her some snacks from the vending machine. Quietly, I exited the room and made my way to the common area. When I got there, a woman was sitting there reading a book. She was in a gown, so I figured she was another patient. She looked my way and smiled, so I smiled back. We made small talk while I grabbed a few granola bars and some peanuts. I told her how we just had a baby, and she told me she had just had a baby too, but she left the baby in a nursery tonight because she was so tired. After congratulating each other, we said our goodbyes and I was on my way back. While we were sleeping, Zachary started crying. My wife woke me up to check on him. When I looked over, I saw someone standing next to Zachary's bed. At first, I thought it was one of the nurses, but when I put on my glasses, I realized it was the woman I had met earlier that night. I whispered out to her to get her attention, but she didn't acknowledge me, so I got up from the couch and walked over. When I got to her and Zachary, I became very uneasy. I put my hand on the woman's shoulder. It was cold and damp. Our son continued to cry, and my wife called out to see if we were okay. The woman turned to look at me. This time, her skin was pale, her eyes were dull, and I remember the messiness of her long blonde hair. She put up her finger up to her lips, signaling me to be quiet. "Ying," my wife called out again. "What's wrong?" I turned to my wife, but before I could say anything, Zachary started crying loudly again. I immediately reached my arms out to take him out of the crib. The woman grabbed my wrists so violently that it shocked me. What in the hell was she doing? "Ying," my wife called out. "What are you doing? Get Zach." I turned to my wife again, and suddenly my wrists were free. The woman was gone. I grabbed Zach and hurried over to my wife. I told my wife that the woman I had met earlier was in our room, but my wife assured me that I was standing by the crib all by myself. "No, she grabbed me. She was right next to me," I anxiously said. That's when I realized that I never saw the door open when she disappeared. I handed our son to his mother and went to check the restroom. No one was there. I opened the door to the hallway and looked around. No one was outside. My wife and I stayed up to make sure that Zach was okay. He was calm in his mother's arms. I couldn't explain what happened. Eventually, we put Zach back into the crib and went to sleep. The next morning, our nurse told us that we would be discharged later in the afternoon. We were so relieved. Baby and mommy were healthy, and I didn't have to sleep on that awful couch anymore. To our surprise, one of our friends came to visit us. She was also a nurse at the hospital and heard we had just had a baby, so she came to see us during her shift. I told her what I had experienced, and her eyes widened. "Are you for real?" she asked. I acknowledged, and then she asked us when we were getting discharged. We told her that we would be leaving in the afternoon. She moved closer to us and started to speak softly. "You're not the only ones who have seen her. A few months back, a woman had a baby at this hospital, but it was a stillbirth. She was really depressed and hung herself in her room. The nurses found her a little too late. After that, people kept reporting that a woman was seen in their rooms watching their newborns." About 3 years ago, my boyfriend Matt, whose father was a shaman, and his first cousin Nick always hung out. One day, they were working together, and Matt called me asking if I would like to take a trip to Wisconsin Rapids to visit Nick's older brother. He told me that Nick met some Nancy chick at the Como flea market and wanted to take her with us to Wisconsin since he didn't want to be the third wheel. I said that it was fine and they just picked me up. Then we left to pick up Nancy at a park. I thought that this was weird because we didn't pick her up at her house. We got to Wisconsin Rapids and hung out with his brother, went shopping, and ate dinner. Matt and Nick wanted me to get to know Nancy better, so that's why they asked her to tag along. It was getting late, so we decided to head back to the cities. As many of you who live in Minnesota and Wisconsin know, Highway 10 is said to be super haunted and is to never be traveled on that road alone at night. Anyways, back to my story. Matt was driving and I was sitting in the passenger seat, while Nick and Nancy fell asleep in the back. We were on Highway 10 when we saw this lady in white walking on the side of the road. I started getting goosebumps and Matt said to just keep straight, but knowing my curiosity, as we passed her, I looked back and she was gone. All of a sudden, Matt slammed on the brakes, which woke the two back passengers. Nick asked what was wrong and Matt said he saw someone in the middle of the road and hit the car like some kind of deer. Nick got out and checked, but there was nothing there. We all started getting really scared because it was in the middle of the night on a long stretched road. As we kept driving, we saw the same lady in white again. Matt told Nick that this was the same lady we saw hours ago. Matt kept praying to his ancestors to keep us safe until we got home. Once we got back to the cities, it was around 3 a.m., and we went to their aunt's house, who was also a shaman, to drop off some items Nick's brother gave her. For some reason, Nancy refused to get out of the car and got super scared, so she stayed in. We thought she just didn't want to because she was shy to meet the auntie. So the three of us went inside and we told her the experience that we had encountered. She tied a red string to all of her wrists and told Nick to tell Nancy to come in so she can tie a string as well. However, Nancy kept refusing, so the auntie came outside, and once she saw Nancy, she went back inside without saying a word. She told Matt and Nick to make sure they dropped Nancy home right away, so we did. Again, we dropped her off at some park because she said she only lived a block away and didn't want to wake her parents up, so after that, they dropped me off. The next morning, Matt called and asked if he can come pick me up because his auntie wanted to talk to us, so I went back to their house. And that's when she asked Nick how he met Nancy. She said that Nancy wasn't human, and when she came out that night, she saw that Nancy's face kept changing and her looks kept changing. That's when Nick finally admitted that when we were in the car driving, he kept looking at Nancy's hand. They kept changing shapes and sizes as well. He said 1 minute her hands and nails would be short, then next it would be long. He didn't want to say anything to us because he was already scared of her. So that's why he purposely wanted to take her to his aunt's house, knowing that she had the Hmong knife and red tape at her door. The aunt called Nick's brother and asked him if he saw the Nancy girl we took. He told her that it was only the three of us. That's when we got really scared because I actually spoke to this girl and went shopping with her. Their aunt had to do a shaman ritual for all three of us. After that incident, we never saw nor heard from Nancy ever again. It was late at night, maybe around 1:49 a.m. I was heading home from work, but I needed to pump gas first. As I let the gas pump fill up, I found myself falling asleep, but I fought the temptation. I looked across the other side of the road and noticed a very unusual figure. I couldn't tell if it was someone or not because I was sleepy. I rubbed my eyes to clear my vision and looked again, but there was nothing. I thought I was seeing stuff because I was tired. The gas pump clicked off and I started off back home. As I approached my apartment, I felt an unusual sensation around my neck. The feeling continued the whole night until I got to bed. That night, I dreamt about walking around the forest in what looked like to be Laos. The forest was empty with no animals in sight. For some reason, I was pulled towards this one tree. As I looked up the tree, I saw a young girl being hung to death. Right when I was about to see her face, I woke up from the dream from a loud bang. I didn't know where this loud bang came from. My first thought that it was one of the pots hanging in the kitchen, but I was not going to go up and check because I didn't want to die yet. I stayed in bed until the next morning to see what the bang was. As I entered the kitchen, I saw that the pots were perfectly fine and nothing was wrong. I thought nothing of it. For the next couple of nights, I kept getting woken up from loud bangs. I also kept dreaming about the girl being hung in different places. I told my parents and they told me to call a shaman. The night before the shaman was supposed to come, I had the same dream, but this time it was different. I was in my room and I saw myself sleeping. I noticed something in the corner of my room. As I entered the darkness, I noticed that it was the same figure I saw the other night. As I looked closer, I noticed that the body was hung and kept hitting the wall and made a loud bang. Right when the body hit the wall, I woke up from the dream. When I woke up, I looked to the corner of the room where I saw the body in my dream. I used the flashlight on my phone to see what was in the corner. As I flashed the light, I saw the hanging girl looking straight at me. My whole body went numb and I ran out of my room. I went into my car, leaving all the personal belongings in my apartment unlocked. I didn't care and went straight to my parents' house. The next morning, a shaman came by and performed a ritual for me. Afterwards, the shaman told me that the spirit followed me home from the gas station because it saw that I was alone that night. The shaman said that the girl committed suicide because she was lonely with no one in her life. She followed me home in hopes of taking me with her. From that day on, I never lived by myself anymore. One of my husband's close relatives recently passed away, so we had to go to their funeral. She was considered a grandma to my husband, so we were their grandkids. She calls me Nya, which is daughter-in-law in Hmong, and when she was alive, I was a Nya to her. Anyways, it was late one night at her funeral. I told my husband that I was leaving to go home because I had to get our 3-year-old son from my mom's house. My husband said he would stay behind and he would stay late. We'll have his brother drop him off after the funeral. I asked him if he has his keys to open the door so that he didn't have to wake us up. He said that he has his keys and he would let himself in. I left and went to go pick up my son and went home. We got home around midnight and my son was asleep, so I carried him to his room. I showered and got ready for bed. By the time I was ready for bed, it was already around 1 a.m. Since my husband was staying late, I didn't think much and went to sleep. I was extremely exhausted. Suddenly, I woke up to the sound of knocking at the door. I thought to myself, who would come to our house this late? Maybe my husband got a little drunk and couldn't make his way in. I was a little irritated at this point. I heard knocking again, and then I heard a voice that sounded exactly like my husband's, except a little deeper. The voice kept saying, "Open the door. Open the door. Open the door. I'm cold." As I listened, I could tell it wasn't my husband's voice. It sounded very familiar, but the tone was different. I got scared, thinking it could be an intruder. The knocks turned to pounding, and the voice changed to my husband's dead grandma's voice. Then she said, "Open the door, daughter-in-law. Open the door. I'm cold." I got so scared because I knew then it wasn't a human at the door. It was something more than that. I went to my son's room and brought him into my room. I wasn't sure if he heard it too. I tried to hide under the blanket to drown out the noise. However, the pounding got louder and louder. It seems as though she might even knock the door over to get in. Her voice just kept getting louder and louder, telling me to open up the door and quickly, it's cold outside. Suddenly, my phone beeped with a text message from my husband saying that he was now coming. The pounding and chanting suddenly stopped. I called my husband and told him to come home quick and I'll tell him what happened. I fell asleep afterwards. It seemed like only 30 minutes and I heard knocking at the door again. This time, it sounded like my husband's voice. "Open the door. I'm here. You told me to come home and I'm here now." I got excited and felt a little relieved at the same time. I got up and slipped into my slippers. As I walked to the door, I noticed the light outside isn't on. We have a sensor light that I turned on when I got home. If someone comes, then it triggers the sensor and the lights come on. I was confused. How can he get to the door without triggering the sensor? Then I heard his voice and knocking. Open the door for me. You told me to come home. I took a peek outside and did not see anything in the dark. No figure and no one. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I ran back to the bedroom and closed the door. I called my husband and asked where he was, and he said, "We got delayed a little. We'll come home in a little bit." My whole body broke into a sweat and I was so scared. I was so tired by this time, and mind you, I was 6 months pregnant with our second son. I finally fell asleep waiting for my husband. It seems like I slept well. Our 3-year-old son usually comes into my room to wake me up by lifting the blanket off my feet and tickling my feet. I felt the blanket lift up and tickling the bottom of my foot. Without looking, I said, "Sonny, stop it. Mommy is tired." Usually, when I say stop, he would giggle, but the tickling continued. So I told him to stop again, but no response from my son. I looked up and saw that it was my husband's late grandma that was tickling my foot. She was standing at the end of my bed, dressed in her Hmong clothes. I couldn't move. It seems like I was stuck frozen. I couldn't seem to get any noises out of my mouth. My body was frozen where it was, and I saw that my husband was sleeping next to me. I saved all the energy and elbowed my husband for him to wake up, but he didn't budge. Finally, I turned around and put my arms around him and yelled for help. I didn't get a response from him. He had his back turned towards me. I shook him and told him that his grandma was here. I noticed he wasn't wearing pajamas. Then the body slowly turned to face me, and it was not my husband. It was his late grandma. I tried to get up and run, and she grabbed my arms and said, "No." I suddenly woke up, and I could hear my husband opening the doors with his keys. The outside motion sensor lights were on. I was so scared I woke up sweating. Here's a true story that has haunted me to this day. Years ago, I worked as a security guard at a funeral home. This particular day was in March 2007, during a wake scheduled from noon to 9 p.m. Some lady had passed away, and there was a small gathering of people. Shortly after 9 p.m., everyone was gone except the funeral director, a clerk, and myself. After thoroughly checking all the rooms, the funeral director locked the 2 main viewing rooms. Then he and the clerk left. My shift ended at midnight, so I had to patrol the exterior rooms for a couple of hours and lock up. If I needed to get into the main visitation room where the bodies were, I had to call the director. Anyways, I had been doing this for a couple of weeks and gotten over most of the jitters. I was relaxing on a desk in the main hall, watching television, when I heard a loud thump in the room where the body was. Now on this night, there was only one viewing and the casket was closed, and some flowers were placed on top before we locked the doors. When I heard the noise, I turned down the TV and listened intently for a long time. I heard a scratching sound, or at least it sounded like it, so I walked slowly to the double door and put my ear against it. I could hear something like footsteps or movement. It sounded like someone was walking around in the room. I thought maybe someone had accidentally been left behind, so I knocked on the door and asked if anyone was in there. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and then they seemed to come towards the door that I was behind. I got really scared, so I backed up. The handle to the door started to move slightly, and that's when I took off. I ran until I reached a busy intersection and then called the funeral director. I told him something strange was happening in one of the visitation rooms, that I heard noises. I didn't say anything about the footsteps or the door handle. I didn't want to sound crazy. I just mentioned that there were noises. He told me to sit tight until he got there. I didn't want to go back, but I had to. After 20 minutes or so, he was on site, and we both went into the building. He walked into the visitation room with no fear and opened it. There was nothing there. but he did notice the bed of flowers that were on top of the casket was on the ground. The funeral director looked around and then picked up the flowers and put them back on the casket. Then we both left and he locked it up again. I told him I didn't want this job anymore and I was going to walk that night. He looked at me like I was crazy, but I left and never went back.